Good day. Thank you for joining us on the OSR session on machine learning and neuroimaging. What do we agree on and where are we headed? My name is Sanmi Koyejo. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Computer Science. I'll be your moderator today. And we're going to start off by introducing the rest of our panel. I'm going to go off the order that I have on my Zoom. So Saige, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Saige Rutherford. I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan right now. I work in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan for the past several years. I work across a lot of different labs. We kind of have this core group where we provide computational and statistical support to investigators doing neuroimaging. So I've been exposed to a lot of clinical neuroimaging research over the past several years. I also worked in Detroit on fetal imaging prior to the University of Michigan. And in about 1 month, I'm moving to Nijmegen, the Netherlands, to start my PhD with Andre Marquand, which I'm super excited about. Nervous, weird time to be moving, but excited nonetheless. And I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you for your introduction. Manjari?
Hi, everyone. I'm Manjari Narayan. I'm a postdoc at Stanford in the School of Medicine. Until recently, I was doing a postdoc in psychiatry, where I've been working with a lot of data in TMS, fMRI, TMS, EEG, and so forth, to understand how we can find better, more causal biomarkers of psychiatric illness. That was what the lab was working on. My broad interests are in, rigorous interrogation of how we infer networks like functional brain networks, but also more recently, how we can address the presence of like bias in networks using ideas from causal inference.
Great, thank you very much. Satra?
Hi, everyone. I'm Satra Ghosh. I'm a principal research scientist at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT and an assistant professor of otolaryngology at Harvard Medical School. I'm mostly an applied machine learner for most things. I don't do any theoretical development. For most part, do delve into it a few places. What we try to do is we are trying different kinds of sensors, brain imaging, wearables, voice, language, all kinds of sensors that could be associated with a smartphone, which is a plethora of things at this point in time, and trying to use it to develop markers that can track individual behavior with respect to mental illness mostly. But our applied work goes to detect voice disorders. We try to do closed feedback loop systems to treat certain types of disorders. And then in the brain imaging or neuroimaging side, try to predict outcome in the context of psychiatric illnesses. And as I said, we don't do too much theoretical work, but some of the work we do look at dimensionality reduction and other kinds of representational transforms that could be useful in the context of machine learning. And one last thing, lately we've been working on a deep learning package called NoBrainer, which we plan to do some extensive work on over the next 3 years in trying to understand both generative processes as well as other aspects.
Thanks, Satra. And Gael.
Hi, I'm a research director at INRIA, so I'm a computer scientist and applied mathematician. I've been working on brain imaging, in particular functional brain imaging, for a bit more than 10 years, pretty much developing machine learning for it. I've been interested in cognition and mental health, and currently I'm expanding in more health-related problems wider in this pandemic's time. And I've also done some fairly fundamental machine learning work, and I also do a lot of open source development, including in machine learning.
Great. So as you can tell, we have a truly awesome panel today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So we'll get started with the reason that we're here, which is the question of how can machine learning on brain images contribute to progress in neuroscience? So I'll keep maybe the same order. If you want, you can jump in maybe Saige, do you have thoughts on how machine learning can contribute to neuroscience progress?
Yeah. So I kind of see two forking paths. One is, kind of learning new things about the brain with these models, and the other is kind of automating tasks that are maybe like tedious and time consuming for humans. So my first kind of foray into deep learning and machine learning, I mentioned I did fetal imaging. Adult software tools don't work for the fetus. So we used to have to manually draw brain masks and extract the brain from maternal tissue. And that was super, it would take like several hours as an undergrad. I spent so much time doing that. And then when I came to Michigan, I was kind of like, hey, I have all this trained pre-labeled data. What can I do with it? There seems like I should be able to do something cool with it. So I trained a convolutional neural network to manually identify the brain. So that's kind of this example of like a, very boring task that was just very time consuming. I've seen recently there's a lot of successful work with like image segmentation, even, speeding up free surface reconstruction. So I kind of see those two unique forks that have, there's a lot of progress being made in both. I'm probably more familiar with the, automating tedious tasks than discovering new things about the brain, but I'm also very interested in that. Another thing I'm really excited about, recent work in a lab that I'm a part of has looked at reliability of predictive modeling. So I think there's been a lot of hype about the poor reliability of fMRI, which is a very, real concern. We care about our data, but if you step back and look at the big picture of things, like we don't actually, I think most people doing like task fMRI and resting state, we don't actually, we want to relate it to behavior and brain function. So the reliability of the underlying data is important, and people have shown that it can be very poor. But when we look at the reliability of the predictive models, that is using a scan from day 1 and a scan from day 2 to predict a phenotype, looking at the reliability of that prediction, it's actually much higher than the reliability of the underlying data, which is something we're really excited about. So I feel like machine learning could really help us increase the reliability of the data that we're using. So I'm very excited about that. And then finally, another thing I'm excited about is transfer learning. So my poster this year at OHBM looked at, so I work in psychiatry where a lot of people, we're a site for ABCD. So we do contribute to big data, but there's also a lot of people who are collecting, data sets of, on the size of like 50, maybe 100 subjects. So my poster this year looked at using big data like ABCD or the Human Connectome Project to kind of discover the brain features that can be used in a predictive model. And then can we bring those over to truly out of sample clinical data sets collected in very different populations for very different reasons. And it's still very, at the beginning of that work, but it's, I'm excited about the results, and it's seeming like we can use these bigger data sets to help discover more reliable like brain features.
Yeah, I find that framing really interesting. I think particularly the idea of automating some tedious tasks resonates. Jerry, do you have, I guess you've done a lot of work on reliability in particular. Would you like to maybe expand on how machine learning might help on neuroscience progress? Manjari?
Oh,
frozen?
sorry. I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, how can machine learning, in your opinion, how can machine learning on brain images contribute to progress in neuroscience? Maybe in the context of some of your work on reliability and statistical learning problems.
Great. Yeah, so I definitely agree with the top thing I was going to say about how machine learning can help and how it's already helping is, I think, we've the way data analysis has often been in neuroimaging is that we do a lot of pre-processing and then we do model fitting at the end. And I think the fact that we've built up so many tools like machine learning has pushed everybody to build so much automation in this process that we now have the chance to really optimize the final objective with respect to everything we do end to end. And so I think that that aspect of just flexibility of optimizing the whole, data analysis process with respect to some objective is, I think, one of the ways in which, analysis of brain imaging data is really going to benefit from machine learning. So the automation part. To answer your particular question about reliability, I think a lot of machine learning so far has sort of focused on, how do we do predictive modeling such that we minimize average prediction error? And when we talk about reliability or retest reliability, what we care about is the prediction made for an individual going to be repeatable in future instances? How good is that? So and there is a lot of new work happening in machine learning to really think about other metrics in the context of predictions, not just average prediction error, but optimizing the error associated with individual predictions. And I think that's where we rarely quantified that aspect yet so far. And so I think that's but that's going to be important, and putting uncertainty, minimizing the uncertainty, increasing the precision of those. Is the precision good for some individuals but not for others? So I think those aspects of machine learning, we haven't yet focused on that, but I think there's a lot of chance of optimizing the whole process with respect to metrics like that. And so I think that's really exciting, potentially powerful.
Very cool. Satra, do you have thoughts on, maybe from the applied point of view, some of the impacts?
Sure. I think part of it is it's a new tool, right? I shouldn't say a new tool. It's another tool that allows us to explore the information space in neuroscience. And we're still trying to understand at what level, at what scale, whether it's spatial or temporal, does information exist. And one of the things is a voxel. We can acquire it, but it may be a very noisy source of information. The whole brain may be very stable, but not going to help us a whole lot just by itself. As a single point of information. So I think machine learning allows us to kind of take an approach that says we can find sources of information and model complex nonlinearities in that space of information, which would be very difficult to do with certain other methods. And so in some ways, I kind of see it as a model that helps us kind of deal with the nature of the brain, which is a complex system. But there's also an applied side to it. So some of the work we've done is in real-time fMRI. And Cameron Craddock, Stephen LeConte, and others have used machine learning as that applied thing to quickly process data coming from a scanner to provide real-time feedback back to the subject, right? And now you have a closed loop system where you can perturb the input and output of the system and look at how things change. And these are places where I think you get to understand the nature of this black box that sits between our years. So I think that's a way machine learning can be quite useful. And this is apart from all the applied things in terms of tumor detection or psychiatric illness detection. But those are more kind of traditional bread and butter problems in machine learning, whereas I think part of the goal is to kind of understand the model that is inside our brain.
Thanks, Satra. So Gael, do you think that the biggest impact is going to be in this sort of tool automation direction, or is it going to be on sort of the science that Satra has been just talked about? Where do you think the biggest impact?
The biggest impact, that's between those two aspects, which I agree both are present.
Or maybe additional ones. No.
I was planning to reframe part of those, but I think that's a good, that's a good way of seeing it, as an automation tool, as a modeling tool. I'm more excited about the modeling tool, but I think the automation is quite important. I think it's crucial. I mean, we want things to scale, so we want them to be automated. But as a scientist, the modeling tool makes me excited. And if I can, reframe what this is doing to modeling, and if we take a step back, we used to only have access to external manifestation. We'll call them behavior. We now have many different signals that allow us to look inside that thing. Signals of different nature. But if I present you one of those signals, if I show you a bold image, if I show you an ERP, You won't be able to say anything about this because the signal is too complicated, because by looking at it, by staring at it, you can't say anything. And this is why we need brain imaging. Because, this is why we need machine learning, because brain imaging by itself, apart from simple cases like strokes, and even with simple cases like strokes, it gives us a signal that's too complex.
So
Okay,
wanted to
good.
respond a little bit to Gael a bit there, in that I think I framed something as an automation aspect, but I think implicitly there is a modeling aspect to it, because I'm implicitly changing the scope of the models by saying I can directly take a whole pipeline and optimize what I'm fitting based on purely the objective. So they're sort of intertwined. The fact that I am framing things, the automation is enabling me to be more non-parametric in a certain way. So they're almost not separable in a certain sense.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on this. And if we think about the challenges that, so for instance, the reproducibility challenges, for instance, in an ARP study, the problem is not that the statistics are done wrong, it's that the statistics can apply to only part of that pipeline. So I'm completely with you that one of the exciting aspects of machine learning as a modeling tool is that in this large, framework, and whether we like greedy algorithms or gradient descent or Bayesian, we can fit very complex pipelines, and then we can reason about them in a statistical way. So I'm completely on your side.
So to follow up a bit on this thread, maybe I'll start with Gael this time. So there's a lot of high interest in more modern methodological tools, I think, but particularly, say, deep learning as a way to address across sort of automation, across machine learning, across statistics. To what extent do you think maybe that's the tool that will help unlock sort of this next level of progress of machine learning and neuroimaging, or maybe other methodological tools that might have a big impact? Maybe a bit on the tooling specifically.
So I'm super excited about deep learning. If we take a step back, and I don't like the word deep learning. I would rather prefer representation learning or differentiable programming. But those concepts are fundamental and have unlocked completely some aspects. However, if we take a step back, once again, and I've been doing tools, I've been doing methods for brain imaging for 10 years. And I don't even believe in this anymore. I think what's going to make a difference is the data and not the method. So sure, deep learning is going to make a difference once we have the data. Currently, I see a lot of deep learning papers, not all, but a lot of deep learning papers are simply overfitted on not enough data in brain imaging.
Sasha, can you say how Gael is completely wrong? Or not? Do you have thoughts on?
I was muted. So I think, again, part of it is what's the effect size that you're looking for. And some things are so large that you don't need as much data to do some of those things. But some things are small. So I think there's no kind of standard answer for everything. It's a tool. It comes with its complexities, and one has to use it appropriately in certain ways. But when you're fitting millions of parameters, yes, you better have some data. So I completely agree with Gael from that perspective. But there are things about the tool that we're learning kind of at a theoretical level every day. Overfitting turns out to be actually good for many neural network models in various ways. And it allows it to generalize to other problems that it normally does not. So there's a world of things where theoretically, and Gael disagrees with me, obviously, where we don't understand the complexity of the tool we're using as yet. And I think that's a place where I won't just use it as a straight up hammer. I think there's work that needs to be done there as well. But if you're just using it from a prediction perspective or an automation perspective where you have an input and a target, it's an optimization problem. And you go through validation. If it does it well on some outside validation, even if it trained on little data and it generalizes, that's okay. So I think one can look at it from an engineering perspective and say, does this work? And if it gets you from place A to place B and does it robustly and reliably, that's okay.
Gael,
any thoughts on? Go ahead.
I'd be curious to hear you describe an ideal data set for deep learning. And are we getting close to one right now? Like, I think a data set I'm most excited about and I've closely worked with is the ABCD data set, because it will It's at a very unique period and it'll end up being longitudinal data. But I would love to hear you describe like your ideal deep learning data set.
Well, it's a good transition to Satra's comment, because I completely agree that if something generalizes, I don't care how it's built. And that's a good rule of game. And so the ideal data set is something that allows me to show a natural generalization, natural interesting generalization. And for this, I need diversity. So ABCD is great, and it's a step of the pipeline. But if I want to show that I actually have something that really does generalize, I will need to apply it to another data set, and to another data set, and to another data set. And this is what we seldom, maybe never see. And when once we start seeing this, then it gets exciting.
In my poster, I used ABCD to predict or to improve classification of children who stutter from healthy controls. Would that be a good example? So like using these big data sets and seeing if you can learn a model and a representation that can be applied outside of ABCD.
Now that's a really great example. This is a very, to me, fundamental thing that we can do with machine learning. The power of machine learning is generalization. And if I can learn a surrogate biomarker, a surrogate measure that, something, it's a black box, but it's useful when I take it and I carry it over across scanners, across populations. I don't care how it's being built. If that's useful, that's a success. So yes.
Manjari, do you have thoughts on maybe these or other tools that you think might have an impact?
Yeah, so I think deep learning is, there's some very exciting things about it. And part of my excitement, I think, sometimes the things to be excited about are not necessarily the most obvious things. And it resembles something that happened 20 years ago with the sort of sparsity revolution. Everybody was very excited about compressed sensing and using the lasso and sparsity. But what really happened along that time was that we really improved convex optimization. Like there was a lot of math and a lot of infrastructure that went into saying we can impose structural assumptions and like solve problems that way. And that really opened the door to so many new things. And it seems like with deep learning, sometimes, you might not have enough data to actually use some really sophisticated neural network architecture to fit your models. But there's a lot of supporting infrastructure that's been built in order to do deep learning, such as, automatic differentiation. You can now take a really complex problem and without having an analytical solution for what the gradient is, you can still solve that problem. And I think that, for example, that aspect of what the deep learning, revolution has sort of unleashed is going to become, I suspect that's going to prove very useful to us, even if we're not using neural networks. So, I think there's a lot of aspects there's the deep learning in the narrow sense where you're talking about really deep neural network architectures, and then like the whole space of everything that has happened because of deep learning. And, there's a lot of, we shouldn't bucket all of that into the same thing. There might be a lot of aspects of it to exploit, even when we're in a modest dimensional space where it's not in the hundreds of thousands of data points regime, we're still going to be able to benefit. And that, I think that's exactly what's enabling the kind of automation that I referred to earlier. The other point I think that was brought up about generalization, I think that's where, the statistician in me, we always produce estimates of prediction error. We don't actually know whether those estimates are actually how well they reflect the true generalization error, right? And I think, Gael has done a lot of really great work showing how difficult that problem can be when you have very small sample sizes, right? Like cross-validation is not a panacea, it's not a solution. I think that's the generalization part that we're still getting a sense of, how well are we actually testing generalizability, right? It's easy to fool ourselves that we've met some pretty good enough threshold, and when in fact we haven't. And I think that actually, that's an aspect of if you look at the theory of deep learning models, like one of the trade-offs is that you've basically made this trade-off that you will be able to use really, really complex models, but now you you are fundamentally going to have lesser ability to put precision on how good your predictions are. So you're actually making a trade-off when you say you're going to use, it's valuable to fit really complex models, but maybe you're not going to be able to quantify, you're losing precision on your predictions in exchange for doing that. So there are some trade-offs being made that I think, you know, we need to broadly understand the implications of that for ourselves.
Satra?
So I'm going to quickly follow up on the generalizability thing and just punt it to Sanmi, because I know he's moderating the session, but he's actually done a lot of work in this space. So I'd love for him to kind of say a few things around that.
What would you just generally about the discussion, or specifically, maybe you can.
So some of the
reframe.
generative
Can you
modeling
answer this
work that
question
you have
yourself?
done.
I think,
Yeah.
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 So I don't have a great answer in terms of, yeah, I don't have a great answer right now. Sorry, I'm a little bit taken off. I was reading the future questions and I was trying to set that up. And so that's why I was trying to pitch to Satra to repitch the question to me, so I wouldn't have to have
Sorry, I did not mean to throw you under the bus completely over there.
Yeah. So if you repitch me the question, I can try to quickly answer and ignore some of the.
So maybe I can rephrase it a little bit, just knowing some of the things you've done in the generative modeling space and looking at some of the things. So it kind of looks at this process, this machine learning or the neural network or the deep neural network as a way to generalize our understanding and about processes. So could that help in the generalizability problem that we are seeing?
It's a tricky question. I think early days, I'm optimistic. So I think you're speaking specifically about trying to synthesize data, if I understand correctly. So one of the things, the threads that we've been pursuing is trying to explore the possibility of synthesizing data that looks like real data, but actually is more controllable. It actually is tied to one of the comments that came up earlier. These are data where we don't expect that we can sort of fully understand the process mechanistically. So it's not a good model from a scientific point of view, but it is sort of high fidelity from the point of view of realistic data that sort of matches the task that you're trying to solve. And the hope is that if you can do this well, you can use these as additional data to tune your models, to train models, to get a sense of sort of when things are working and not working. Early results are promising. I would say it's still a bit early. So we have some, for instance, promising results on being able to automate trying to sort of figure out power and sample size for an experiment by sort of synthesizing automated data at different sample sizes and using these. So under the hood, there's this big GAN model that's doing all of the heavy lifting. Around this, there's a sort of scientific statistical problem where we're trying to build tools to help answer useful things. So the answer is I'm optimistic, I guess, the extent to which, again, some of these tools can help answer sort of more fundamental questions. I wouldn't say that we're all the way there yet. Okay, thanks for not completely throwing me on the That's a really good question, though. So following up actually a little bit on that, maybe I'll ask you a question. So one of the questions that came up was thinking about when you're building machine learning models for this automation, but actually I think this is relevant to modeling as well. So when they break, I think for simpler models, there's a feeling that it's easy to, particularly if it's maybe hand designed, it's easier to fix things when they break. What do you think maybe the state-of-the-art approach or best practice is when a machine learning automation of a process breaks? Should we be training things from scratch? What might be the best way so that these tools which are actually working well, which will not always work perfectly, what are the best ways to maybe handle issues with that?
Can I just say a quick comment about this from like a coding perspective, and then maybe others can answer more in detail. Save a version of every script that you write. can't stress that enough. Like so many times you will rewrite and then not understood what you did to get it right the first time. So version control.
Okay. Any other thoughts on how
So
to
maybe I
fix
can take
these
a
problems?
quick stab at the debugging problem. So it's hard, and especially if you're looking at some of the neural network approaches, they're very finicky. I think we break things more often than we fix things in most of the things that we do, and we learn over time. And we learn rules of thumb more than kind of generalizable principles that work all the time. And sometimes those things generalize and we are happy with. But I think a lot of things are about not the perfect solution to something, but something that's useful. And this might go back to Manjari's point earlier about where do you establish the precision and accuracy of something. For certain applications, you decide what is the acceptable range. And as long as things are within that acceptable range, things are okay, things haven't broken. If you try to push it, and I think this is the part where everybody's trying to get the best thing, but we don't know what we are comparing it to. Often people will say, or in our case, we try to predict mental illnesses. What are we comparing it to? A clinician's diagnosis. And there, we sometimes even know that a clinician's diagnosis has a lot of inter-rater variability. So how do we kind of think about comparing two things that are both inherently variable? It's kind of looking at the precision of our sensor or tool and asking the question, is it within the same range as what we are trying to match it to? But I think the DNN side, we're still discovering things every day. And there's significant interactions between not just the model, but the hardware and the technology we run things on. And so there's a significant engineering component. As the size of memory on these hardware grows, we are able to do other things. So there is this balance between what we might do theoretically from a neural network standpoint and what we might do practically from an engineering standpoint that's constantly playing into things that we do.
So that was okay, Gael. Please.
I just want to say that if it breaks, if you apply it to new data, then it doesn't generalize and you've just fooled yourself. Maybe you fooled yourself for technical reason because of some underflow or overflow in the library, but it doesn't generalize.
So maybe the fix is thinking more carefully about testing and actually checking generalizability as opposed to maybe over believing some of the tools that we build. So there was a question which actually sounds quite interesting. At the beginning, so we pitched that we think that machine learning is helping and will help more and more in discovering fundamental things about the brain. What do you think is the most exciting discovery in the last few years using machine learning to understand the brain, and what are you expecting to happen in the next few years? Any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to quickly say that, so we do, labs I work in do a lot of brain behavior predictions, mostly from functional. Most of our papers have been using resting state fMRI. Well, I work with a lot of psychiatrists who are interested in clinical. Maybe it's because the data sets we're using are kind of like Human Connectome Project and, tend towards healthier controls, although what is that definition is a whole other discussion. But we've kind of seen really we can just predict cognition. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, is how can we move just, beyond predicting like some latent variable of cognition, because we might call it a lot of different things, but I really do believe we're kind of stuck at this predicting cognition state. And I really hope to see the next few years, maybe we leverage our ability to predict cognition to help predict more clinical variables, but I'm definitely going to be focusing on it. I think a lot of people are, but I think nobody's really come out and said that, like, hey, we can just predict fluid intelligence right now. Like, and why, how are we going to move beyond that? So I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Prove me wrong.
Any thoughts on Gael, please?
So I'm going to go a bit in the same direction and frame it in a big picture. What I'm excited about is what I call surrogate measure or surrogate biomarkers. And I'm going to take a specific example that's a bit of a trivial one, but it's the one that has worked best, at least for us and our friends in the last few years. It's predicting aging. And that's definitely not something I was excited about. It's boring, but it works. And it goes back to, effect sizes, it works. Then the thing is, once you've predicted aging, then you've got what people call the, the brain age delta, the difference between your brain age and your chronological age. And now that's a surrogate biomarker. And it is potentially super useful. And now if we go back to fluid intelligence, that, well, we are having a hard time predicting. Well, maybe we don't have the good proxy outcome. And if you do public health, a super challenging question is, what's a proxy outcome? And if you do health, the choice of your outcome is crucial. Half of the problem is choosing the right outcome. So we have some outcomes for which we have success, and they're useful as proxy measures. And we have other outcomes for which we don't have success. This, gradient is super exciting. So I'm pretty much restating what Saige said.
So maybe to follow up a bit on that, there's a question about, there's now more and more there are large databases and data sets, yet when they find significant results, the specific example here was with Enigma, where you find results say in depression, but the effect size is so small that they're hardly relevant. And the challenge is, I guess we pitch large data sets to some extent. Are those the complete answer, or is maybe the question a bit more nuanced? Maybe Manjari can start with that and also comment on Gael's discussion of surrogate measures. I know, you're going to answer a different question. I think you're muted if you're speaking.
Sorry, you can hear me now, right? So I wanted to follow up on Gail's comment on surrogate measure. So one thing to clarify, Gael, are you using the word surrogate measure here just to loosely mean an intermediate phenotype, or are you using it in the stronger sense of surrogate?
I'm using it in the stronger sense, in the sense that's, somewhat inspired from psychometrics, even though I think we need to revisit the psychometric literature.
Yeah. So there is a notion in the regulatory context of, surrogate endpoints. And, I've recently been thinking a lot about this issue in that, when we're looking for, we want an intermediate measure to replace, longer term outcome. And traditionally, you think about cancer and survival, like survival can be increased by 5 or 10 years. You can't wait around to find out if something works or not for 5 or 10 years. So you really want shorter term outcomes that are a really good mechanistic substitute for the longer term outcomes. And that's, there's a whole literature on these kinds of measures. And I think, it's harder. There is a sense in which we are looking for the same thing when we want to, predict cognition or deal with, clinical symptoms in mental illness, and that we want to substitute self-report measures with other intermediate measures, that's like, brain imaging measures, but we really want it to be a really good, mechanistic substitute. And it turns out there's a lot more, the fact that the surrogate has high predictive power on the outcome is only the beginning, like necessary requirement. It's not a sufficient requirement, because there's because we haven't established like how good is it mechanistically. So there's like these criteria that this, if you have a treatment and a surrogate and an outcome, not only should there be a strong correlation between the surrogate and the outcome, it needs to be not confounded. It needs to be that the treatment has a strong effect on the surrogate, that the treatment has a strong effect on the outcome, such that, the surrogate explains almost all the variation of why the treatment is related to the outcome. So it needs to have like the strong mediation kind of idea and so forth. And we don't talk about all of that. We've only, I mean, for good reason. I think it's just establishing that the surrogate, like a brain measure, has good generalizable predictive association with the outcome has itself been a challenge. But I think we're getting to the point where that aspect is getting a bit more mature. Maybe we're doing a better job of that. And so I think we can now start thinking about the surrogacy aspect more seriously.
Any other thoughts on the nature of the data? I guess, the sort of sophistication of the question. I'm thinking again of this this question of it's not just data, there's a lot more to answering questions correctly. Gael.
So beyond, even when we're asking the right question, it's a general trend in health research that effects are going down because we've already, picked up all the low-hanging fruits. And it's a general concern of health and pharmaceutical research. So it's an unfortunate truth, and we are going to have to deal with, smaller effect sizes unless something magical happens. That's true everywhere.
And maybe I can
Okay.
just quickly follow up on that.
Yes,
I
please.
think it's really about signal detection at some level. And what models are quite good at is if you had a model saying you know where to look for a signal, it makes the signal detection problem easier. And I think part of whether a data set, we now have so many features that we can extract, transform, create from the data that we have access to. What we are missing is a model that tells us what to pay attention to. And we're kind of using some of these tools to help us do that. But I think there's a secondary thing needed to understand the biology, to understand the interactions, to further point the light at what things we should be paying some attention to.
To follow up on that, there may be more work on this that I'm unfamiliar with, but something I've often thought about with deep learning is, we have all these different modalities for neuroimaging, all these different ways of measuring the brain. Does anybody have any thoughts on using deep learning models to help connect the modalities? I think there's many scales at which we're measuring the brain, and a lot of times we make we don't back up some of the claims jumping between them. So I've thought a lot about maybe the possibility of deep learning models helping us bridge scales. I would just be interested to hear anybody comment on if that's not possible and why, or maybe there are people already doing that that I'm unfamiliar with.
There is some cross-modal work.
Yes.
I haven't looked at it very much because that's not the kind of stuff I'm excited, but people do cross-modal work where they use one modality to predict the other, and then it might be useful as a form of missing value imputation in a in multimodal work or data enrichment. This exists. It's often called cross-modal.
Yeah, my sense is that that's not, at least I'm not aware of mature versions of it. I've seen one-offs in various papers. Manjari, maybe comment a bit more.
Yeah, I think Saige brought up a really good point that I'm sort of excited to see future work on. So to rephrase how I understand it, when she talks about scales, I think it's that, well, with MRI, we can now, in fact, even with MRI, different types, whether it's 3T or 7T, we can already look at spatially across, centimeters versus millimeters in MRI versus temporal scales between fMRI, EEG, and MEG. And I think one sort of question we haven't yet asked that we probably could be asking and machine learning can help is optimizing the right scale of features that maximizes predictive power. Like, I don't think we have a principled answer to actually, if we look at things, well, we have some, we know that actually large scale brain networks and fMRI are a really good thing. But to ask that more broadly, incorporating all the modalities to say, actually, we have the best signal to differentiate, depression versus PTSD by looking at this scale of data on the spatial side or on the temporal side. Like, I think we haven't done that kind of scale optimization across modalities, and we're probably just in the early phases of that. So I think that there's more to be done in that aspect of cross-modal. I think that's exciting.
So since we have only a few more minutes, I'd like to ask one more panel question. So we're in the open science room. I guess an appropriate question is, what is the role of open science and how can it make science better in this subfield?
I think it's not really a question anymore. Like, we've made such progress recently with more people sharing code and data. And I think at a lot of levels, there's just more pressure, and it's kind of becoming like, you don't have a choice, you have to, or you're like publicly shamed on Twitter. But besides that, it also just, a lot of us are doing very similar work. And I think it would just be so much more efficient for new people, new students, if we shared code and data, you know, like as a science, but also just as a tutorial teaching resource. Like there's a lot of people who don't maybe have strong mathematical coding backgrounds who would really benefit, you know, are very curious and would really benefit from like more, you know, not just messy dumped code in a GitHub, but kind of tutorial style. And there's definitely a lot of that being done, but I think we still have a long way to go with kind of the tutorial aspect of how to use these, because I think there is kind of a steep learning curve for people.
Any other thoughts on open science and its relationship to machine learning?
Yeah, I think there's something quite fundamental, is that science has always been about generalizable findings, but quite often the generalizability has been implicit. I'm going to do data analysis, I'm going to come up with p-values, in the discussion I'm going to say, oh, very general statement, and then, you know, whack. No proof whatsoever that this is general. Somebody else does a different data analysis and says, oh, you know, confirm general statement, not confirm general statement. With machine learning, we're moving in a situation where I can have a model with like a machine learning model with my, you know, statement, and then somebody else ideally should be able to pick it up and apply and say, ah, well, works, doesn't work. You know, this is a dream that goes with both open science, you know, code, models, data, and machine learning.
Maybe I can just say one of the things Gael brought up earlier is about data being required for many of these things. And while the Enigma Consortium has shown a certain model, I think the more we can do that as an open science thing, share data and diverse data, because that's going to help not only help solve the biological questions, but also the engineering questions. Things have to work across different characteristics of data. And alongside that, share the model. So many people put code out there without the trained weights that come along with it. So you're not really sharing the model. You're saying how to build the model, but I wouldn't be able to test what you showed in a paper without the actual weights. So kind of put those things together. And then again, as an open science, BIDS has helped kind of consolidate an impedance matching between code and data. So make sure that your code works with kind of standardized representations that we can work with. So I think those are things that open science can definitely help drive, and I would welcome and encourage everybody to do so.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of minutes. Maybe I'll ask one more question from the panel to the whole panel. So in neuroimaging, we really want mechanistic insights, but deep learning models, as we've discussed a few times now, mostly give us black boxes, but maybe are reasonable for prediction. When should we, or why should we use deep learning at all? When should we pick machine learning broadly, maybe deep learning specifically, in various kinds of applications? I just leave it up and anyone.
The deep learning is a black box, but it doesn't always have to be. At OHBM in Rome, I did an educational tutorial on brain age prediction using this like deep learning model, and I showed you can kind of tailor the input. Like I tested it using just the gray matter mask, just a white matter mask, just a CSF mask, separating those masks into different channels, then using the whole image together. So there are still, I think it's kind of an easy cop, like just to say, oh, deep learning is a black box, and it can be, and they are very complicated models, but it is still possible to probe them and have some level of understanding of what's happening. And that's definitely a very active field of research to better understand what's going on in those models. So I don't think we should give up and say it's just a black box and we'll never understand what's going on.
Gael?
I just want to like counterpoint on the mechanistic understanding, and I'll take an example that's not from brain imaging. We wanted, and we still want, tests of COVID. I don't care if those tests are mechanistic understanding of COVID. I want to know if my next door neighbor has COVID or not. And we should stop jumping ahead of ourselves. And we're in a situation where our diagnostic of diseases, of mental diseases is pretty bad. And we're trying to get, you know, understanding. No, sure, understanding, but I don't care if a black box works, it's useful.
we don't fully understand how anesthesia works, and we use it all the time.
Thank you.
So we may end on this fun, controversial topic. I feel like we could go on for a while. If there's a counterpoint in 1 minute, I'm happy to.
So I'll put in one little thing on that topic, which is people are doing some work trying to understand the mechanisms of the brain through deep learning. But I'll approach this from the perspective, just because a model behaves in the same way as a human or an animal does not mean the model is a good model of how the brain is doing it. It simply says, I show the same input-output relationships. And I think unpacking that remains a challenge, but it's kind of the other side of this to say, one way in which people are doing this is by trying to say these layers in the network map onto these layers in the brain. And that's a starting point for a conversation, but I would be very hesitant to say this is a model of the brain at this point in time.
Let me add another note there, actually on an optimistic note. I think the extent to which, deep learning models are certainly more complicated than, like high dimensional linear regression, for example. But at the same time, we're sort of tackling the same issue in both places. Like when we fit high dimensional linear models, we wanted to know, well, which variables are important and what the hell does a variable being important really mean? And so now we have analogous questions we ask about the layers and neurons and so forth about deep learning. And we're making a lot of progress in developing analogous measures of, well, what components about the model were really helping us make improve predictions and so forth. So there are techniques to unpack the black box. And I think none of those techniques are really going to give us scientific explanations and understanding that we're looking for. So I think it's a matter of calibrating expectations. So I think the black box accusation is, in some sense, I feel almost unwarranted. It's almost as much of a black box as regressions are, in the sense that regressions don't sometimes give you the understanding you seek, and maybe the deep learning models will also not give us the understanding we seek. But
so with that,
yeah,
I think we're right at time. This is, I think, a great note to end the conversation. Again, as you can tell, it's an exciting topic, and we could have gone on for quite a while. Thank you so much to our panel for taking the time to discuss this today.